Are there key indicators that you can look at, like maybe some key numbers or things when you look at a firm and say, hey, this one's got it going on, this one's really missing when you're
Yeah,
looking at the.
gosh, there's so many. There's so many common elements that you see that success has, leaves clues, and there's certain things that
Yeah.
the best firms do on a consistent basis, even though they can be wildly different. I've worked with firms that are like they might have 400 or 500 employees, and they're multi-state, and they just got a massive operation, and then other firms it's like it's two attorneys and they got 8 people, or and everything in between. And you see, we've seen revenue numbers, whether they're spending on labor, what's the average fees that a attorney should generate in a plaintiff personal injury environment. And while there's these general rules that guide you, there's also the anomalies or the exceptions where you're like, okay, well, this is the general rule. This firm does it a little better. Or this is the general rule, but this firm does it a little bit worse. And but you get these parameters, and I can tell you, like, so right now when I go into a firm, I'll do an assessment, and I'll gather some information from them. I'm looking at their profit and loss statements for the last 3 to 5 years. I'll look at some of their intake metrics and data. I'll look at their closed case statistics, and based off those three sort of data sets, I can give them a lot to go on for 12 months. In some cases, they'll say, hey, look, you just okay, you got to tighten up here. This is a little bit out of whack. Let's create your budgets over here. And so to kind of answer your questions, the way I approach it is having taken all that information that I've seen from firms over the past, almost 15 years doing this, hundreds of firms looking at their data, that I start with, okay, where is this firm currently? What are their current strengths, weaknesses? And it's just like a health check. And I've done, so many of those over the years and I think I've had one firm where, people call me and I'm like, okay, what's driving this call? Is it a quality of life thing? Like you're trying to be more efficient, or have more discretionary free time? Or is it a profit / growing thing? Like we're trying to scale, we're trying to, grow the firm, we're trying to increase profits. And while those are not mutually exclusive, usually when people reach out to me, one or the other is sort of driving a little bit more. Sometimes I have guys say both. I think out of all the years I've done this, I've had one firm where I'm like, dude, you're working the hours you want to work. Your firm's making a really crazy health profit. You're in the upper 1% of all the firms that do this. What's your drive? And he's like, no, I just wanted to get a check and make sure that, I was like going to the doctor and making sure that everything was healthy. I was being proactive about it. It's good to hear from someone but other than that guy, there's been so many that, okay, here, work on this. And so we'll start there. When I go into a firm, I always say, look, there's two baskets of low hanging fruit, in my opinion, because a lot of these things that you work on are like disciplines that you just do consistently over time, and you start to see some results. The two quick fixes, I would say, are one, intake. Like when I go into a firm, you go like straight to intake. You're like, okay, if we clean up some stuff today, you're going to see benefits tomorrow, and you can do a lot of stuff in 30 to 60 days, like a ton of stuff, and it's just some really low hanging fruit. The second thing is when we're working with the firm, I'm like, look, let's go. Can we flag the top 5% of their cases in the building? Like, do we have them flagged, and are they with the right person, and are we going to maximize value, and what can we do? We got to make sure that we do not undervalue those cases, and we just get the best results. Because in a healthy personal injury firm, they've seen their top 5% of their cases typically generates around 50% of their revenue. And
Wow.
sometimes in cases it's a bummer, because sometimes firms aren't totally in touch with what those top 5% are. And I'll go in there, and we have to find them first. And there's an art to finding them. It sounds easy. Well, just go find your top 5%. Well, the more cases you get, it's more and more of an art.
Very hidden.
There's science to it, but and we just try to make sure, like, look, let's max out those cases. And I know that sounds simplistic, but even if you grab one of those cases that was about to settle, maybe say it's about to settle for $1,000,000, and you push it to get an extra 500, again, sounds simplistic. When I go into firms, it happens all the time. And just putting the brakes on that process from happening and making sure you get top value, intake, top 5%, max value, has a pretty big short-term impact. And then you go hit all the sort of long-term strategies after that.
Yeah, and I would say what's nice to hear this is a lot of times everyone's just focusing on leads, and that's just one component, right? You got to close, you got to sell, and then the other thing is getting maximum value. That's where profit margins are created. So when I hear, so digging into this a little bit, when I hear, getting maximum value, I think of like two types of firms, and maybe there is a hybrid firm. I think of like the pre-lit versus the litigating firm. Are you saying the pre-lit firm, maybe they should refer out to the litigating firm, and that's what, and they're doing something improper there for that 5%, and that's how you'd maximize value?
Well, so one of the things, like when I'm working with the firm, so we those two aspects where you're like, okay, let's intake, and then let's just find the top 5%. Okay, cool. Now you go into these longer term strategies, and one of the first things that I push very strongly is a crucial conversation that most firms are uncomfortable having. And what that conversation is can the attorneys, if the goal of every personal injury firm is to identify the cases with the most potential, get them to the attorneys with the most skill, experience, and results, and support them with your best resources. If that's the goal, and that should be the goal of every personal injury firm, if you're going to execute on that, one of the first things you have to do is have the attorneys sit around and get some agreement on which attorneys the ball needs to go to when a case develops. And so that's sometimes an uncomfortable conversation, but the firms that aren't willing to have it, it's like, having, a football team and everyone wants to be the quarterback, and they're all fighting over who's going to be the quarterback, and no one's running routes, and no one's blocking. So it creates this unintended chaos. So one of the first things I'm like, all right, guys, let's just have a conversation. Let's say that all the attorneys in this building, we're going to put them on a scale of tier 1 to tier 5. And tier 1 is you're fresh out of law school, or you've never done personal injury, and you're going to require a ton of supervision. This is the definition, right? All right, tier 5. This is an attorney that has been first chair and made multiple jury trials, and gotten verdicts in excess of $1 million. You trust them with basically any case in any venue. And look, these are fast definitions, and I work with each firm to kind of develop it, fine tune it. But the concept is now, okay, attorneys, now that we've all talked about, and we define tier 2, tier 3, and tier 4, and while there's an outline for it, I like each firm to kind of adopt it to what they feel those things are. And I try to keep it kind of clean so that you can figure out where you fall. And I ask each attorney on their own, and it's in a survey that we do just online, and go, all right, now that we've defined these tiers, self-rate, where do you think you fall? Like, just have an honest, like, I think I'm a tier 5. I think I'm a tier 3. I don't think I'm a tier 2. Put where you think you fall. And the second thing that I ask you to put is, where do you want to be ultimately? And if you're, you might put, hey, I get it. I'm a tier 1. I just started, doing this, but I want to be a tier 5. I want to be, a great attorney. That tells us a lot, right? And so we'll take that information, and a couple things. Sometimes when I'll work with the leadership at the firm, or the owners, the partners at the firm, I'll go, all right, guys, here's what all your attorneys, Joe thinks he thinks he's a tier 4 and he wants to be a tier 5. And sometimes the partners go, oh my, Joe thinks he's a tier 4. He's out of his mind. He's the tier 2. And the point of that is not to go beat up on Joe. It's not to make him feel like, he's a bad person, but gosh, you got to have those conversations. So you go to him, hey, look, Joe, look, I saw you put 4, and, you got to hammer that out, because if Joe thinks he's a tier 4 and he's really a tier 2, and you're trying to assign cases and get the cases with the most potential to the attorneys with the most skill and results, and Joe thinks he's one of those guys, well, you just got to get that out of the way in a conversation, versus like making it awkward every single time a case is assigned, right? And firms that aren't willing to have that conversation will operate in this really murky, like, I don't want to take a case from him, or we're not supposed to pass the ball in that situation because, we haven't really discussed it, and he thinks he's just as good as this guy, even though this guy's gotten a bunch of jury verdicts. And it's designed to just have and look, sometimes we'll have attorneys that are like, hey, I get it, I'm a tier 2, I want to be a tier 3, but I really don't want to be a tier 4, tier 5. I don't want to try cases. I don't want to go, depositions, and can I play in this ballpark? And that's also awesome. Like, all right, if you're cool, you want to be a tier 3, you're going to max out there. Here's what your role is. When a case looks like this, you're going to pass it to the tier 4, tier 5, and you're going to identify those. And if you do that, you help out our clients, you help out our firm. You're not going to be in a position where you're in over your head. Awesome, great. And some firms will kind of like, everyone's got to be tier 5. No, not really. We need people playing different roles on the team, but just talk about it. And so many firms are like reluctant to talk about it, and it just creates issues. So like when I go to a firm, that's one of the first things I'll hit and go, let's just talk about this.